Alright, welcome back to our tutorial. If you haven't seen the previous parts, please do so, because this is a continuation. We are creating a bounce plugin. Okay, so far what we have is a plugin that lets your object fall under the influence of gravity, but it keeps falling forever, and nobody wants that. So let's add another force that is going to force this thing to bounce off the ground. Okay, so we've told our plugin that the ground position is 0, so let's use that to our advantage. So now we need a way for this to know if we have reached the ground. Okay, so in order to do that, let's add an if statement. We're going to say if like so. If we say the position y is less than the ground position. Now think about it, the position starts at a positive 5, so it's 5 meters in the y-axis. That's where we're starting from, in the y-axis. So as it goes down, if it bypasses the ground, it becomes less than the ground plane. So that's why we are checking if it's less than the ground plane, which means we have reached the ground. So let's bounce. So let me create a bounce force here. Now the bounce force is going to be equal to our bounce, which is this value right here. And then that value, we multiply it by the velocity. Now the reason we're multiplying it by the velocity is because the faster an object is moving, the more it should bounce, of course. The slower, the less the bounce. So we're going to use that velocity or speed against the object. Now, from my own testing, I found that this value is rather very small. So that's why I multiply it by 100, something like that. So this number can be anything you want. The reason I'm doing this is because I want the bounce force to be very, very high. It has to be higher than the forward motion so that the object can actually change direction. If, for example, the object is moving at a force of 2, for me to change its direction, I have to add at least a 3. So once we have a bounce force, we're going to use that to subtract from our our force here. Now in order to do that, what we do is let's create bounce force here at the beginning and say bounce force, let's give it a value of 0. Okay, we give it a value of 0. Actually, instead of doing it this way, let me just use an else statement here. Let's get this force, put it here, and say minus bounce, right? Bounce force. So the force is mass times gravity, but we want to subtract the bounce force from this. Okay, I could subtract the bounce force from the acceleration as well, which would mean I don't need to add this times 100 because the numbers will be smaller here. But I prefer to do it this way for no good reason. So let's put an else statement here and put our force inside there. So what's happening here is this. If the ball is below the ground, use the bounce force. Subtract the current force. Subtract the bounce force from the current force. That way, as the ball is going up as it is bouncing, it's slowing down. Okay? Now, as it goes up, it goes above the ground plane. So use this calculation once the ball is above the ground. So normal is this, bounce is that. Okay. And just like that, we have created our formula is complete. So let's test this and see what happens. And as you can see, it's bouncing, which is pretty cool. Now, one problem we've noticed here is that it keeps going down even after everything is done. So we want to cancel that. So I'll put a little bit of a cheat here. Let me cover this space. I'm going to check if, for example, the position y is less than, which is what's happening right here. If the position y is less than the ground, set the position, let me do this, set the position to ground plane, to ground position. So if it's less, leave it there at ground plane. So this means once the object goes below the ground, we're going to leave it at ground level permanently. So let me remove this and try that again. So exactly, that's what's happening. But now it's not bouncing. So what we're going to do here is put an equal sign instead. Okay? Because this is actually acting before the bounce starts happening. So we have to make sure that the bounce has already happened before we do this. Now, if you notice, this bounce force is only created once we hit the ground. So what I could do is check for this bounce force, if this bounce force exists. So I'm just going to say if bounce force, so just by putting that, I'm checking if it exists, and then I'll use the AND. So if bounce force exists and the position is less than the ground, then do this. Now, AND is okay to use like that, but I like to use the more technical one, which is 2 ampersands, like that. So if this is true, leave the thing down there. So let's see if this actually does the trick. So let me go back and say, and you can see it works. But then there's that jittering bouncy thing that remains continuously bouncing there, which I don't like. So what I'll do to make sure that it stops bouncing, I'll just add a little bit of subtract 0.01. So I'm going to say once it bypasses the ground, put the position right below the ground so that it's permanently sitting there. So let me try that again. This is very cheating of this thing, so it's a dirty trick, but it works. Okay, now another problem we have here is that the simulation only runs once. Once it runs, no matter what we do, it doesn't run again until we remove and add the plugin. This is not very ideal. So what we can do is to tell it that it should reset at frame 0, so that every time we take it to 0, we can start again. So in order to do that, let's go up here at the top and add an if statement. So let's add one and say if, let's say, if the frame number is less than or equal to 0, then we reset the velocity. Let's say velocity, we put it at 0, and then the position y of the object, we put it at the default number, which in this case is 5, right? Now, in order to avoid, because the position y does change, we might want to change it here, and in order to do that, let's add one called initial position. Initial pose is equal to 5, something like that. And then let me just set this to initial position. Okay, so instead of removing initial position, I'll just, instead of setting this to 5, I'll put initial position there. This is better because then I can simply change initial position and this will also change. Okay, all right, so let's try that again. And then run this, and then it's bouncing quite nicely. But when we take it back to frame 0, it starts again, which is really, really cool. But instead of saying velocity 0, oh, actually, this is correct right there. Instead of saying frame less than 0, let's put start time here, so that we can adjust the start time here. If I put a 20 here, which means it will only run once it reaches frame 20. So let me remove that, add it again, let me go back. So it will wait until frame 20 and then it will fall. Very, very nice. Okay, so far everything has worked, but the only thing we're missing is a user interface, because once our user double clicks here, nothing comes up here. So we need the user to be able to change things like the gravity, the mass, and so on. So I'll see you in the next tutorial when we do that. Thanks for watching, and subscribe, support me on Patreon. I'll see you next time.